Hi, Srikar. Welcome to TwiceTold.
Thanks for having me, Praveen. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. So I'll start off by introducing you to the concept of TwiceTold. TwiceTold is an exchange between author and reader. Both of us come together, discuss our experiences, those that you had while you wrote the book, and the ones that I had when I read the book. So TwiceTold because you endeavored to write this book having a certain view in mind. This view got further sharpened, refined when you discussed it with others and wrote it down. I formed some impressions when I read it for the first time. I made a series of questions, 34 to be precise. And
Okay, that's a lot of questions. But yeah,
and hopefully when I discuss these questions with you, so the book becomes truly twice told because both of us are now hashing or rehashing our experiences, clarifying and hopefully learn something new from this whole outcome. And that's why twice told.
yeah. I mean, it's been told a few times. It's been twice written also in the sense I had to rewrite so much of the book. So many edits also happened. So this is the polytold uh, version, I suppose. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'll start off with my first question about growing up. Why is it that Kannada influenced you more than Tamil? And you did have a brief interlude in Telangana. So how come Telugu did not have that kind of formative impression on you?
Um. So yeah, though I was born in Bangalore, my early childhood was in Hyderabad. My dad was working there, and I actually picked up very good Telugu, or that's what I am told. That I picked up excellent Telugu and I speak very well and all. But after fourth standard, we moved back to Mysore, and so the Telugu sort of faded into the background. I can't speak good Telugu now. I mean, I can understand, I can speak a little bit, but Tamil and Kannada we spoke both at home, and both were sort of mother tongues in that sense. But officially, on all the forms and all, I'm a Kannadiga, and I think my dad was also, he used to emphasize, you're officially a Kannadiga, despite the fact that we spoke this bastardized Tamil at home. And so, because I grew up in Mysore, Kannada was always the sort of local language. It's what we spoke at school with all the friends, and it was the source of humor for us also. It was wonderfully uh, sort of polyphonic mixed bag in Mysore. It's all sorts of influences, English, Dakni. So it was that sort of street Kannada that I grew up speaking, and I studied most of my life in a Kendriya Vidyalaya, it's a central syllabus school. But first standard, because my parents had just left me with my grandmother for 1 year in Mysore, so I studied in a state board school, and that's when I had picked up reading Kannada. But after that, it was never around. So I never actually read Kannada, never practiced writing Kannada. It was just an oral sort of thing. And I mean, I could read maybe a headline, I could find my way around Kannada, but I'd never indulged in it for the sake of just discovering it and all the history and culture that comes with it. If you so I grew up reading only English books. It was very uh, one language kind of thing. And so when I came to my master's in Manipal after my engineering, which was again another debacle, so we were encouraged to read in Kannada, or everyone was encouraged to read in their mother tongues, to read literatures in their mother tongues, and quite openly they said, enough of T.S. Eliot or Shakespeare or Chaucer. You can discover that on your own. There's hundreds of books about that already. But Indian regional literatures are by far quite neglected, and so they encouraged us to start reading. And so the first year in my master's course, I think one of the papers or assignments, not a paper, an assignment I wrote was about U.R. Ananthamurthy, one of his short stories. And again, there's huge encouragement. Professor was like very good and all of that. And I also felt that it was finally time to catch up with this, you know, history and legacy that this Kannada tradition has, that I've seen around me, I've heard about, but never actually, partaken of. And so I started reading Kannada, and it was difficult for the first few months. It was just uh, trying to, use a dictionary, get into that reading scene. But once that initial hurdle was passed, then it began to feel much more comfortable, and it felt like a very personal quest. Also, this sort of getting away from my Macaulay upbringing and trying to understand this land that I've lived most of my life in. So that's where that came in, I think.
Fantastic. So, are you a second generation Kannadiga, or your parents have lived here for longer than that?
Oh, they've been living. My grandparents have also been living here. So they come from Talkad. Talkad is this small village, 50 kilometers from Mysore. There's a lot of storied history. It used to be the capital of the Gangas in centuries ago, and there's all sorts of myths and legends associated with it. Temples and the sand dunes and history associated with the Wadayas and so on. So they've been living in Talcott for at least a century now, or much before that. Then at some point migrated from Tamil Nadu, I think sometime in the 19th century or something like that. Not sure. But so yeah, for generations they've been speaking Kannada, and so my grandparents who were avid readers of Kannada and Tamil also, but I've never picked up Tamil. I hope to someday. I don't know when that will happen though.
That's immaterial because it's more important you learned Kannada. And for me, this is the expression of the perfect immigrant, one who imbibed the resident culture and became more native than native themselves, so to speak.
Well, I don't know if I can call myself an immigrant. I'm a native only,
Right.
just in the sense that English to Kannada migration.
Yes, yes.
That yeah, yeah.
Now, my next question is going to be about your literary rite of passage. So, is it something the way that you described Cove's was? People were,
Sorry.
is it, was your rite of passage into Kannada similar to the
Mm.
way that Cove described his passage? People
Kumvi,
quoting Kuvi, is it? Okay, okay.
Kumvi Bhadrappa.
Kumvi.
Yeah. So yeah, for the listener, Kumvir Bhadrappa is a Kannada novelist and writer. And in my introduction to the book, I have a passage where Kumvi just reminisces about the 1970s, where he's going to Dharwad and he encounters all of these writers and activists and this very peculiar, attractive culture that he wants to be desperately part of. And so I felt very similarly when I was trying to rediscover this world, 50 years later. Like, how do I get to know these people? So many of them are dead. They've left behind a literary legacy. That's something to work with. And so yeah, it was a sort of heady fascination with uh, things that happened half a century ago and before, but that seems to have some kind of a connection to things that are happening right now. They set off debates, they set off ideas, they set off political ideals that still sort of reverberate. They're not dead yet, thankfully, completely. But it was sort of throwback to a very different time. And when I was doing my masters, so I was encountering these writers. It's Devnur Mahadeva, D.R. Nagaraj, Ananthamurthy I mentioned. So that was the sort of tipping point for me. Like, okay, it's time to read these writers. What are they saying, and to discover them for myself in my own personal capacity. So that's also what got this book project rolling in some way, I think.
Understood. Now, reading Rama Bhima Soma, it's difficult to put a finger to it and say what is it effectively or essentially about. So, how did you come to terms with the book's scope? Because there's so many wildly different topics all coalescing under one title. So, how did
Hmm.
you eventually decide on the scope?
Well, so the it started off with the story of Saket Rajan. So that was a friend of mine. Again, when I was doing my master's, a friend of mine told me about this Maoist revolutionary from Mysore who was shot dead in 2005. It turns out that he's a distant relative of my family. So he's someone born in the same social background, trying to reckon with these privileges, trying to, fashion a political identity. We have the same initials. I heard he was the same height as me. He used to play the mandolin apparently when he was a kid. So did I. And he also started out in science, quit that, then went to journalism, went to IIMC Delhi before he became a Naxal and all of that. So that sort of personal resonance, like who's this guy from 50 years ago who did all this, and then uh, that got me very curious on a very personal level, and so I started um, seeking out people who knew him, and he'd also left behind two thick volumes of the history of Karnataka, Marxist history of Karnataka, which was interesting and problematic and intimidating and difficult to read. And but all in all, it's fascinating to me, this whole story, and the idea that he wrote this while he was incognito, running between safe houses. I don't know of too many Naxals in this country who've done something like this. It's a very unique story. And my master's thesis was some hodgepodge of ideas to do with these movements, these left movements. There was farmers' movements also happening. I tried connecting that to the history of peasant rebellions that Saket Rajan talks about in his work. So a whole bunch of the hodgepodge of ideas. And after the thesis was very bad. It was written during COVID, and it's just a complete mess. But that's when I heard about this New India Foundation fellowship, and because of the pandemic, they extended the deadline by 2 months. And then suddenly I was back in Mysore, done with my master's, hapless thesis to my name. And okay, something has to be done to salvage this thing. So I thought I could take this and then maybe a more substantial project about, you know, 20th century Karnataka, this particular period, post 70s. Because at that time I put together a proposal, and the proposal, again, it was very rudimentary and sort of instrumental in the beginning, where my whole proposal was to look at social movements and then try to use literature to talk about them. That because I was a literature grad, and So that was going to be my entry point into this. And so my proposal to the New India Foundation was to tell a cultural history of Karnataka through its literary sources primarily. And they liked it. And so once I got the fellowship, I came back to Manipal. And again, I was working with this broad framework. What are the uh, major social movements that are happening? Whether it's farmers' movement, the Dalit movement, environmentalism, street theater, feminism. So these were the broad sort of ideas that I thought the book should, the scaffolding of the book is probably going to be this. But then I started reading and interviewing and talking to people. And then I realized, of course, the book can be so much more than this. It can, it can be a sort of free association, thematic, non-chronological essay type, collections. And so it kept evolving, depending on what I was reading and what I thought would be interesting to a reader who doesn't know anything about this, which was me before I started writing this book. So if it's interesting to me, then it might be interesting to a reader who's encountering it for the first time. And so I moved. I was writing this book in South Canada, and of course, Shivaram Karanth was one of the first names that sort of leapt up at me. Like, I've heard about this man, but what do I really know about him? And so, so that in itself became one chapter where I'm talking about Shivaram Karanth, his life, and then other things about South Canada, Pilivesha and Yakshagana and the art of K.K. Hebbar. So once I found some theme, a person, an idea, a movement, a metaphor, and then I started writing about it, then so many other things also came into the ambit, and I just sort of let it become whatever it was going to be. That's why it's a bit of a it's all over the place. It's about everything at the same time, and so yeah, that sort of holds true for all the themes in the book. Also, I think.
It's a fantastic historiography of Karnataka. Ram Guha should have authored one, but I think even Ram Guha should sit up and take notice that a young journalist like you has taken a stab on such a momentous body of work.
Oh,
So
I mean, Ram
congratulations on
Guha
that.
was on the panel that selected me, and but Ram Guha is also very aware that he doesn't know Kannada, and for a long time he's been, I think, writing about the fact that uh, a book about Karnataka. In fact, some article I think he had written where the life of Shivaram Karanth as a sort of metaphor for history of 20th century Karnataka. That would be a great project. I think he writes that somewhere. So I think he was very happy to read this. He was one of the first people I sent it to, and he said he enjoyed it, and he was very helpful throughout this project.
Understood. Now, there's one aspect that I thought was could have perhaps been elaborated more. So, could you tell us about Kannada pre and post Kaviraja Marga?
Um, yeah, so the Kaviraja Marga is it's it's somewhat it's probably the first extant Kannada text. I mean, there's also this Vandaradhane, but I'm not sure if they've actually dated it to before the Kaviraja Marga or after. It's somewhere around the same time. But clearly, there's so much sophistication in the Kaviraja Marga. There must have been other Kannada texts before that. We haven't found it. It's just lost to history, perhaps. There are inscriptions, there are other literary evidences of Kannada. In fact, there's somewhere I was reading, there's some Greek play from the second century or something that has some lines from old Kannada, something about pass the beer or something like that. I'm not sure. I haven't actually gone and checked it, but I'm sure there's so much more before the Kaviraja Marga. But Kaviraja Marga is a bit of a landmark uh, text for Kannada historians, Kannada nationalists, you name it. And it's a unique text. So Sheldon Pollock has written extensively about Kaviraja Marga, and he says it's probably the first text, certainly in South Asia, but probably in the world, that does this kind of theorization of grammar and poetics, where you're fusing the vernacular with the cosmopolitan Kannada, meeting Sanskrit in a very self-conscious, driven sort of way. And so if you look at it, there's some very interesting formulations about, in fact, it is the first text that offers a definition of what Karnataka is. Kannadana, he says the land between the river Kaveri and the Godavari is Karnataka. This is where Kannada is spoken. And so clearly this idea of Kannada land is quite old, and it was a very influential text for at least a couple of centuries. It inspired poets like Pampa, Adikavi Pampa, and it really set a paradigm for official Kannada courtly literature. In that sense, it's quite a landmark event.
Understood. So, is this where you borrow the Marga Desi expression which you
It,
then later use in the book?
it could begin with that, but afterwards also this Marga Desi seems to have appeared in texts across centuries. And it's not just in Kannada; it's across Indian literatures. In Marathi, I think is Margi and Deshi. So that notion of the local and the universal, the vernacular and the cosmopolitan, that that is a mainstay in literary culture. And so I came across it in an essay by D.R. Nagaraj, who too was fascinated by this binary. He spent a lot of time writing about it. M.M. Kalburgi's works, like he has 8 volumes, all titled Marga. Uh, and he was also quite fascinated by this whole Marga Desi business. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to have a sort of undying relevance. It's not something that will go away. This battle between the local and the universal. In the 20th century, you have the arrival of the English or the Anglophone world, which is so much inspirational for Kannada writers, beginning from Kuvempu all the way to Ananthamurthy or whatever, right? So you do have this recurring conception of this particular Desi uh, regional genius that is trying to commune with the world at large, and taking in ideas and making it your own in some way. And a lot of political anxieties today also have to do with this sort of um, attack of Western culture or foreign ideas and all of this. So even politically, you have these articulations of nativity and uh, trying to contrast it with this influencing, polluting other that's come from somewhere else. But history tells us that ideas were always coming from all over the place, and In fact, the most interesting cultural legacies have been when these anxieties have been wisely navigated, not shunned or uh, yeah, taken in some narrow-minded spirit, right? So it was an interesting tool, this binary, to talk about all sorts of things, and it set the tone for the book also, I think. Do you mind one sec? I just have to connect my charger.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how the right typically chooses its information, cherry picks rather. Who is to tell these people if they were to make an attempt to understand what Proto-Indo-European was, or that Sanskrit or Proto-Sanskrit was a language used by the Mitanni and later Hittite empires before it came to India? Of course, these are things that which will either blow their mind, and rightfully therefore they try to avoid it. So let's leave them be. I'll move to the next question. The life of Veerashaivism in Karnataka and Maharashtra. They
Mhm.
started off originally opposing Vedic Hinduism, but today they seem to be positioning themselves as champions of the right. Why is that so?
I mean, the history of Veerashaivism itself, it's a very complicated history. I'm not an expert on this in any sense, but I, I wrote an article about M.M. Kalburgi recently, where I did a little bit of a sort of overview of what happens after the 12th century, which is when which is when this movement begins. So what you have in the 12th century is this remarkable rebellion against the cult of the king. I mean, D.R. Nagaraj calls it the corpse of the king. So the corpse of the king is fed into literary culture. So until the 12th century, you had all of these grand champus, as they were called in Kannada, where the king is compared with a mythological hero, eulogized in that way. But after the 12th century, no great champu of this kind of a genre ever appears in Kannada again. In fact, the, uh, the the poet Harihara is said to have physically assaulted his nephew Raghavanka for writing about Harishchandra. He writes the life of Harishchandra, which is about a mere mortal. It's like, no, why are you doing this? So that's how the literary culture changed around the 12th century. And at this moment, the Veerashaiva or the Lingayat, there's huge, contestation about what word to use also about this. So, and if you look at the ideas from the vachanas, they were not called vachanas then. It's a word that comes into vogue later. Um, but there's this very radical questioning of hierarchy, pollution, especially caste pollution. So much so that Harihara, who's the closest literary source we have to Basavanna and the Sharanas, as they were called. So Harihara has these texts called the Ragalegalu, and in the Basaveshwara Ragale, you have an episode where Basavanna is drawing milk from the body of an untouchable, whereas from the body of the Brahmin you have maggots and blood and so on. It's this inversion of identity. It's just trying to point out the absurdity of having these poles as though one is purer than the other and so on. So already in the 13th century, you have a court poet like Harihara. Harihara is not a street poet. He's writing and questioning all of these identities. And so throughout this early period, you have these really extraordinary critique of social structures, of religious orthodoxy, and there is a sort of democratization. But again, we shouldn't take these things in too utopian a sense also, because these were sectarian times. These are also periods. This is also a time when Jainism is being vanquished by the Veerashaivism. So we need to take these time periods with a pinch of salt also, but that is not to deny that these ideas were taking shape, and they were influencing how people lived their lives. And so the story goes that the Basavarna's cohort, they solemnize a marriage between an upper caste woman and an untouchable boy, and this incenses the king. There's conflict, and then there's regicide. The king is supposed to have been killed. We don't know, but the stories themselves tell you something about those times. And so afterwards, there is a rediscovery of the Vachanas during the Vijayanagara Empire, where there are monks and intellectuals who compile digests and commentaries called Shunya Sampadanes, where the Vachanas are, brought into a sort of dialogue format, and these are popularized, and hagiographies are, increasing in number. And incidentally, again, the Vachanas had to be rediscovered in the late 19th, early 20th century. There's this man, P.G. Halakatti, who goes around mathas in the Bijapur region and finds all these old manuscripts, and then he collects them, he compiles them, does a little bit of his own editing, and then again, finally, the Vachanas are brought out and in the modern format that we know, and people rediscover them. So it's a very, very complex, rich history that I don't think I can do justice to in the space of this short conversation. And I don't know much about either. I would like to know more too.
This could be the topic of your next book, as I'd suggested. Perhaps the evolution of Kannada from the Rashtrakuta Empire all the way to Rajkumar, the kind of, what was that expression that you used? This chaste or academic form of Kannada that he then popularized and which is today in parlance.
Yeah, but I am not a Kannada scholar. I hope I impressed on you the fact that I'm a newcomer to this, and like Hare Kannada now is impossible for me to uh, understand. I can only be a beginner at this. So maybe that's a project for someone with better skills and Kannada comprehension than myself.
Very well. Let me move on to my next question. So the Hindutva or Hindu Jagran project during colonial period in Karnataka, could you tell us about that? How did that play out?
You mean the early 20th century?
Yes, yes.
I do have a couple of illustrative uh, characters in my first chapter. So there's, for instance, Pandit Taranath, who was a Gandhian, who's remembered for starting something called Madrasa-e Hamdard in Raichur, but also a big fan of Vivekananda, also very interested in this, what you might call Hindu revival, because it was so much connected with the the freedom struggle as well. Uh, this idea of Hindu Renaissance, but it was far more broad-minded than we from our political times might imagine. And because because of this connection to Gandhi as opposed to Savarkar, I think it was more pluralistic than insular. And so you have another very fascinating character called KV Iyer. KV Iyer is a bodybuilder in his first avatar. He's just he's like the he's working with the Maharaja of Mysore. He started something called Hercules Gym. He's also again trying to harmonize the Marga and the Desi. He's inspired by European bodybuilders like Eugene Sandow. But also he recognizes that all this crass materialism, just this show of physical strength, what is that going to achieve in this age of mechanical perfection? So he fuses it with Hindu revivalist sort of spirit. So at his Vyayam Shala, he has this huge um, idols of Ram and Hanuman, which he worships every evening. So it's only this the spiritual quotient that differentiates it from the just the materialist excesses of the Western bodybuilder. And so KV Iyer writes novels also. So after his bodybuilding career, he's mocked at one point by his good friend TP Kailasam, who is another very interesting character. TP Kailasam tells, or at least the story goes, he mocks KV Iyer for not having read Oscar Wilde. He's like, you're all brawn and no brain. KV Iyer seems to have taken it personally. He starts writing novels. He writes this novel called Shantala, which is again a throwback to Hoysala's. And he writes a novel about Michelangelo, fictionalized. So again, you're seeing a Hindu revivalist, but also this broader cosmopolitanism that I'm trying to tell you that ran with this cohort of Hindu conservatives. They had one foot here and another, in the broader world. That sensibility is, I think, what's gone missing within the conservative Hindu movement, if you want to call it that. That sensibility of trying to be, expansive, trying to look beyond one's feet. So that I found very interesting in the early 20th century, and I warmed to it in some sense too. It was refreshing to know that this was how it was, and maybe there's something to learn from that.
Absolutely, I agree with you there. Is that these are movements born out of anxieties, especially after colonial subjugation and advent of public education, giving rise to expressions of intellect. But what we're seeing now worldwide is an expression of crony capitalism, not so much the upliftment of society per se, as much as a few individuals, and the rest can just rot. And world leaders across the planet are perfectly okay with it.
Yeah, I mean, another thing common to these Gandhians was austerity. They didn't believe in financial greed or excess or show. It didn't appeal to them at all. They were repulsed by it, in fact. So this the Hindu Renaissance also, it was meant to be modest and to recognize that these lifestyles cannot be sustained. It's and so yeah, that's something to look back to as well. Yeah.
Now, my next question would be about languages. Now, I wouldn't use the word Karnataka as much as Mysore presidency. So, what were the languages apart from Kannada that were in currency?
In in Kannada, I mean, there's so many languages, right? There's Dakni, there's Byari, there's Konkani, there is Kurgi, and along the border regions also you have Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, uh, Malayalam. So Karnataka has always been a polyphonic, multilingual, multicultural society, and I don't know these languages, so I had to restrict myself to Kannada, Tulu, for instance. There's so many other languages that if it had entered my book, if I had the capacity for it, it would have completely changed the book, made it more reflective of realities. But given my limitations, Kannada is what I had to stick with. But it's so much more than that. Karnataka.
Understood. Do you see any anxieties play out between Kannada and these other languages? Kannada trying to suppress one at the expense of the other?
Historically, there has been Tamil Kannada tensions have been there for. I mean, the Kaveri issue keeps coming up, but there were serious riots also in 1991. There was riots in Bangalore. Many people died. Lakhs of property destroyed. So these have always been there. In Kannada, in particular, there's been this sort of anxiety that the strong linguistic nationalism of Tamil culture that has not somehow popped up here, or even Marathi, for instance. And but there might be a silver lining to this also, in the sense that you don't have a Shiv Sena like movement in Karnataka. Like you do have Kannada activists like Vatal Nagaraj, for instance. You might have heard of Vatal Nagaraj. He just keeps coming up in the news. He's been there for decades now, and but if you compare him to Shiv Sena or something, he's a positively innocent dude, and some really colorful stuff also. He's nice. I think on some occasion he dressed up as Cupid, just to celebrate love, and as a sort of rejoinder to Bajrang Dal or something like that. Once he just wore a burqa and came. So even the sort of militant Kannada pride, it seems tempered and harmless, perhaps in some sense. Though, yeah. So there has been the sort of uh, political backdrop to Kannada consciousness, but for the most part, it hasn't been that vitriolic, I think, or at least that's what my impressions are. I might be wrong.
Has Kannada's expression evolved over time? I mean, at least between the 19th and 20th century, coming to that academic form that Rajkumar espouses. So, was there a different dialect of Kannada perhaps spoken earlier as compared to now?
Um, in the 20th century,
In the between the 19th and 20th century, was there any change in the way that Kannada is being spoken?
um, not too much, uh, I would think. Um, Over centuries, you have lots of changes, but across the 19th, 20th century, the 20th century again, you have this new Kannada literature that comes up, and Kuvempu and Bendre. So they are, in some sense, creating a new literary language, fashioning a new sort of language. In that sense, it is new. But Rajkumar, again, that was his own flavor. He creates his own flavor of Kannada. It's kind of textbook, but it doesn't feel artificial because he's doing it for the first time. And so this textbook Kannada, in some sense, becomes a very authentic Kannada too. So cinema definitely changes how Kannada is received and spoken. For instance, in the last in the epilogue of my book, I talk about Syed Isaac, who starts a library in Mysore. Syed Isaac is an illiterate man. He was a bonded laborer. He never went to school. He picked up all his Kannada from Rajkumar movies. He says he watched some 180 Rajkumar movies while he was working as a bonded laborer, taking care of cattle, run away from home. And he spoke such fluent, beautiful, idiomatic Kannada, all of which he's gotten from watching Rajkumar movies. So this is the sort of impact cinema or Rajkumar can have on you. And this is not a one-off story. I think so many of that generation watching these movies, they had their own unique relationship with the language. And that is new, I think, in that sense.
Understood. Understood. Now, moving on to Dr. Nagaraj, he identified correctly that if the secular left abandons the cultural and religious ecosystem, the right will swoop in. So, where do you see failures on the on part of the left, especially when we talk about the Chodwali?
Um, so what Nagaraj is trying to point us towards is the fact that across our history, before the arrival of the British, there were actually social movements from the the lower class of society that articulated very powerful egalitarian, pluralistic, heterodox ideas of spirituality or life or whatever you want to call it. One of the things the the left broadly tends to assume about these pasts is that okay, they were the British, and then before that it was just completely Brahminical top-down society, uh, which on the whole is true, but we forget that there were challenges to it. There were always intellectuals and writers and poets who rebelled against this, and perhaps these are the strains that we need to excavate and reignite. Because if we forget that, then what do we have? We have a blank slate where nothing happened and everyone was oppressed all the time. That's not the whole picture. It takes away from the achievements of people who uh, criticized it, who stood up for the better values and tried to fight for it. And so that's what Nagaraj is trying to say, that recognizing these multifaceted strains, this is the great asset of a Desi socialist. And if you give that also away to the Sangh, then we'll be left with no weapons. And so he's writing this during the 80s, 90s, where he's seeing the rise of the right and also a decline of the left. So this was a sort of concerted response to both of these developments, as I see it. And I think it's a very thoughtful premise to begin excavating in intellectual history. And
Well,
connecting to the Chaluvalis, one of the lacunae within the left was this broader neglect of these histories. For instance, I was talking to, in one of my interviews with Ramu, the poet Ramu in Mysore. So he was part of the radical left movement, and he says, "Look, we never understood all of this. We never paid attention to it. We didn't understand these things as comprehensively and as attentively as we would have liked to. And he was very blunt. He said no intellectual came out of these the radical left movements. No democracy came out of it, and but there's a grain of truth in there, I think.
Absolutely. In fact, as you mentioned, agency was the agency that lower castes had across the centuries that was not sufficiently expressed, be it the Bhakti movement, Kabir, Tukaram, Ramdas. There's so many anti-caste movements across history, but left historians, or at least labor movements, relied more on the Marxist-Leninist framework and didn't sufficiently understand or study local peasant rebellions toward the Vedic powers that be.
Well, I mean that the Marxist-Leninist left didn't really get into caste too much. Also, this is another thing I heard. They dismissed it as neer na melo gulle. It's just a bubble on water. It's just going to burst when you sort this out. And the class equation, the class matrix, and all that is figured out when we have the revolution. Caste will just go away. But the history of the subcontinent is much more complicated. I mean, you have anti-caste ideas all the way from 800 years ago, but it's still here. Clearly, it means it's far more deeply entrenched than we might imagine.
Interesting, because I'd seen this same expression play out in Maharashtra with leftist movements. Most of the leftist activists were from the Brahmin class, and they denied the existence of caste and framed more of a class struggle. And one of the biggest reasons for their failing was this. But I'm seeing that same problem play out here in Karnataka as well.
Um, that and also just uh, it's some kind of an icon driven just again going back to Mao or Stalin. Why do you need these figureheads? Why do you need these complicated figureheads? Why don't you so that is also a part of the problem of the left in India right now, I think. Yeah.
Understood. Perhaps this must be something to do with the presence of the Comintern and intellectual laziness. If the Comintern is publishing enough and more material, these activists may not have thought it sufficient, deemed it important enough to study local cholovalis and in history and adopt or adapt them for current purposes.
Well, I mean, one of the things I found really interesting was the very peculiar Desi socialists that Dear Nagaraj is talking about. There was this group of socialist thinkers in Karnataka. I talk about Gopal Gowda Shantaveri, for instance, who inspires Ananthamurthy, Lankesh, Purnachandra Tejasvi. So all of these socialists, they differed from the radical cultural rejections of the communists. They're far more at home in the sense that they look back on cultural traditions as critical insiders rather than critical rejectors, and they saw themselves. They had an ambiguous relationship with tradition. It was not straightforward, and which is why a lot of writers thought Ananthamurthy was a conservative writer. He's still writing about religion and spirituality, and even if in a critical, self-critical sort of way, it's still the subject of his obsessions. And there's a quote in the book. Ananthamurthy was fond of saying, "We searched for God with passion and only came away with reluctance." And so there was. Kuvempu, for instance. Kuvempu, uh, you can't think of a more staunch critic of religious orthodoxy. But the same Kuvempu spends 10 years writing Ramayana Darshanam. This very elaborate, ornate reimagination of the Ramayana. So they tried to keep both sides going at the same time. You have these very powerful critique of orthodoxy and social structures, but at the same time held enough compassion for traditional, you know, legacies and cultural
Understood.
legacies, which is very mature, I think, and worth reflecting on, especially today when you have these spokespersons for tradition who don't seem to know anything about it, but they've become spokespersons. Uh, but it might be worth considering what the response to that might be. Yeah.
Understood. Now, what were some counter revolutionary movements from the conservative side to these chaluvalis at that time in the 70s and 80s?
Well, for instance, take the Busa controversy happened in 1973, where Basavalingappa, the famous Dalit politician, he goes on stage and says, "Our Kannada literature is Busa. Nothing of value in it," and so this sets off a lot of reactionary protests in Mysore, Bangalore region predominantly, and so you have instances where students who are coming into college, if they're not wearing a vibhuti, some guy standing there waiting to swipe some vibhuti on his forehead. There's a lot of angst with regards to Dalits entering higher education spaces, and so in again around the same time, I heard in Kolar, for instance, there was an instance where there was a young boy, a Dalit boy, who topped his class, who scored very good marks in his exams or something, and a bunch of feudal caste classmates kill him, and the his body is found in the floating in the water or something like that, and this really becomes a big rallying cry in Kolar, and this the student hostels become a hub for activism, and so there's enormous reactionary backlash against this new emergence of Dalit intelligentsia, uh, and it's the society that's not able to come to terms with the fact that they're rising up in society and challenging them, and so there are very very disturbing stories of counter revolutionary or whatever you want to call it, and it is against these incidents that the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti is formed, and which really tries to spread awareness about all of these atrocities and so many caste atrocities, and even now they're still happening every other day in the news. You'll hear some things happen in some rural corner of Karnataka. So the reactionary response, it's still ongoing. It's not ended.
Understood. Now, moving on to the Kagodu Satyagraha, what were the reasons, some of the reasons according to you, for its failure, and what are some lessons that we can learn from that for today or in the future?
Um, I don't know if there are any lessons that we can learn. One of the interesting, so there is a book by the journalist G. Rajshekar called Kagodu Satyagraha. It's the best book on the subject. Talks more about it than I can possibly. So G. Rajshekar in the 1970s he goes to Kagodu and he collects stories and recollections about what happened in Kagodu in 1951. Very rich field work he does. And so one of the things he writes about is the fact that the Kagodu Satyagraha itself did not involve the Dalits of Kagodu, who were basically, uh, you know, serving as henchmen of the Gauda, the landlord, and they even testified in court in his favor and helped put down the protesters and so on. So it was a movement that did not take them into confidence, was unable to take them into account, and there were there were spirited effects. I mean, efforts. Lohia and Jayaprakash Narayan also come to Kagodu and they try to rally the protesters who've been jailed and so on. And so one of the critiques was that it was a sort of impulsive movement, but they weren't really sure what their demands were, and it could have been better, articulated and sort of stuff. But I mean, you can say anything in retrospect. Uh, there's no point to dwelling on it too much, I think. But one of the things that came out of the Kagodu Satyagraha is the fact that Gopal Gowda Shantaveri becomes a legislator. He wins elections right after this. Kagodu Timmappa is another famous politician in Karnataka. He also comes out of this. So there was this political consciousness that comes out of this. And I mean, this is not a. And interestingly, the whole issue was on something called Kolaga, which is a measuring instrument. So the landlord would use a smaller measurement when he's giving grains to uh, the tenants, but when he's collecting taxes or collecting his remittances, he's using a bigger one. So they were like, what is this? I mean, this is something that's true of all revolutions, even the French Revolution. There's this desire for standardization of units because you don't know what is, honest and what is just. You need some standard so that people are not being swindled. So, in that sense, it's not surprising. It was born out of inequality. It was born out of a landed elite oppressing the deprived tenants and citizens. So what is your question again? I'm sorry, I got distracted.
So basically about failure of the Kagodu Satyagraha, and what are the lessons we could learn from that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what lessons we can learn, but the fact that these movements happened and they happened at particular points in history and they set off so many ideas and political ideals in their wake. That should tell us something about the power of protest, of satyagraha, of people claiming right over what their relationship with land and landlords and whatever.
Now, my next question is going to be about Adiga's lifeblood of democracy and the censor of conservatives that he notes and socialists talk about. So, what are your views about that? On your views on the lifeblood of democracy?
So it's a collection of essays, and Adiga was he contests from the Jansang in 1970. He was very disillusioned with the socialists, the Congress, and I mean by the late 1960s, the socialists themselves are a very loose sort of bunch. Apart from Gopal Gowda, Shantveri, and the small cohort, there was, I mean, there are stories of socialists even protesting against Indira Gandhi's abolition of privy purses, and so it's ideologically bankrupt in some sense. It's just, and also it's understandable because you had 2 decades of Congress, and they were just so pissed with the monopoly of the Congress. This anti-Congressism is becoming so rampant. So it's against this backdrop that Adiga is trying to be more conservative politically, and he hopes that with free market ideas, with there might be philanthropists, and I have a quote where he says, if we had liberalized the economy, there might have been philanthropists like Henry Ford, someone who would have established universities or done something. So he's saying the Indian state took on so much that it was not capable of, that maybe we need to start thinking of other ways to organize our economy and provide for our people. So he's coming from so that is the sort of historicizing that you need to have. And so does that mean he was a right wing persona? How would he fit in with the current climate? I asked this question to Rajendra Chenny, who studied Adiga, and he said Adiga would have been booked for sedition if he was alive right now. It's just there is no doubt that he was a free thinker, and some of the stuff he said, if he's saying it in this environment, it would have been absolutely blasphemous for the powers that be right now. So uh, he was he called himself a Democrat, Adiga, and he had some sympathies for socialists as well. He sympathized with the broader cause, but he didn't see them as a politically, you know, but he didn't see them as a political ally, or in some sense attuned to what is happening around them. So he became disillusioned, and uh, it just tells you about the diversity of ideas and opinions amongst this particular literary crowd. Adiga, Ananthamurthy, Tejasvi. It's a very unique group of people who said what they feel, who didn't, think, who didn't censor themselves in any way.
Understood. Do you believe Ananthamurthy's Bhartiyati is, or Bhartiyate, how do I pronounce it?
Bharatiyate.
Bhartiyate. Does that parallel lifeblood of democracy? Are there any similar thoughts or topics that they both are writing on?
Um, You mean that essay, the
Yes.
Bhartiyate essay? God, I don't remember what that essay was about. It was so long ago, but he's just in that essay is different. I mean, he's talking about trying to answer this question of what it means to be Indian. It's something that fascinates Indian writers. Like, there's this famous essay by A.K. Ramanujan. Is there an Indian way of thinking, or I think that's what it's called? What does it mean to be Indian? It's a hopelessly uh, unanswerable question. There's a million ways to answer it. There's a million ways not to answer it. But Ananthamurthy was obsessed. He keeps trying to find ways to be an Indian writer, and then he says, "But none of these received wisdoms we have seem to work. Aurobindo, Vedic orthodoxy. These are also not really in any way helpful." So he's searching for some Indian essence, which again is a quest I think is unproductive. It doesn't sort of, there is no one Indian essence that you can sort of distill and pour into your writings or something. I do critique him on that regard. That approach itself is botched from the beginning because I don't think it'll lead you to like one particular place where you can go and say, ah, okay, I'm an Indian writer now. I don't think it works that way.
This is where the twice told aspect is kicking in now. I read it. My next question was going to be about Ananthamurthy, Bhairappa, Mokashi, and Punekar trying to balance Indian thought with Westernism. But I see where you're coming from. These men, unfortunately, they're all men, so that's why I'm using that expression. These men were trying to look at India through that narrow, Eurocentric, nationalistic prism. And whereas India has never conformed to that, there are so many variations of India or Indianness, so to speak. But do you see that there's a Brahmanism in their thought process?
Um, Undoubtedly, it sort of filters in the Ananthamurthy. He tries to guard against it, but in terms of portrayal of women, for instance, in his stories, which is where I draw both Ananthamurthy and Bhairappa together in some sense. There's always a very forbidding portrayal of women. Like in Samskara, you have Chandri, who's just out there facilitating these encounters. She doesn't have an inner self, and I think it was D.R. Nagaraj who, in an interview, asked Ananthamurthy, "Why are your women characters so weak?" And Ananthamurthy says something like, "No, no, you shouldn't see it that way. Femininity can come in through language, through nature. It doesn't have to be personified in women," or something like that. It was just a cop out answer. So this might be a legacy of the Brahminical upbringing, the forbidding portrayal of women. And so I interviewed Pratibha Nandakumar, the poet, and she said she once presented a paper with Ananthamurthy sitting in the audience, titled Ananthamurthy's Female Characters, where she completely blasts him. And then he comes around, he says, did you have to, do such a hit job? And then she's like, did you have to write so poorly about women or something like that? So there are cultural baggages of what you might call Brahminism. But Anantapur is also one of the few writers who tried to, uh, in some sense, go against the grain, critique these notions, but it comes off in ways that perhaps he had to be pointed towards by uh, people like Pratibha Kumar.
My next question, in fact, you hit upon Pratibha Kumar. The very next question is just about that, about her evoking a nostalgic or vaguely traditional view of femininity through the lens of Devi.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly, which I found fascinating. I wasn't expecting to hear about this, but I during our interview, like 20 minutes, our interview, Devi came up, and she's been fascinated by this for a decade and more. And she was just talking at length about it. So I also just let her talk about it, and a lot of it comes into the book as well. And it's very interesting, right? So you have these notions of some ancient matriarchal goddess worshipping society, which I think is true. Like I think the Harappans and the Indus Valley society was matriarchal, it was Venus worshipping. And then you have more of a Jupiter based mythology, whatever. there is, I think, increasing archaeological evidence that the further we go back in history, the more evidence we find of women being more central to societies and so on. So she's coming partly from that kind of, and she also talks about the Kathasarit Sagara, and she says there's so many shades of femininity that are that come up in the Kathasarit Sagara. It's just they've explored such a wide range of subjectivities and ways of being in the world, and so there is that kind of mm, fodder, I think, historical fodder to continue this obsession with the Devi, or the feminine divine, or the feminine mystique, or whatever you want to call it, and which I found very endearing, more than anything. I could sit listen to her for more than an hour, talk about all of this. And so she had one more anecdote. She said when the Bajrangal barged into the pub in Mangalore to attack women who were drinking there, she tried quoting from the Lalita Sahasranama, where there is also the name Madhupriya, which is given to the goddess, is the lover of spirits, whatever. So that again, it's another form of the critical insider. No, you're trying to say, look, there might be more to this culture than you guys know about, and you can be critical of some things, but maybe there are some other things that are progressive, or radical for their own times and for our own times as well. And how does it change your view of the world once you realize that things in the past were so different? And if you really claim to be inspired by these pasts, and you want to somehow recreate them or whatever, why not this? It's provocative, maybe ahistorical, but still, it's a way of engaging, a mature form of engagement only, I think.
I wish all these activists had studied Engels along with Marx, because Engels put exactly this point about matrilineal societies turning patriarchal with the advent of agriculture and the concept of surplus.
Mhm.
That restructuring society, because you then had free free bands of marauders who could then attack these surpluses, and that leaning toward more masculine and therefore patriarchy, because by way of warrior bands.
Right.
But this, of course, is a very loose expression. Unfortunate that our Chaluvali leaders did not take this into account. But one thing that they do keep coming back to is desacralization and ethical erosion on account of westernization. Why do they see it as that instead of evolution? Why do they see it as desacralization?
Well, it is real thing, desacralization. For instance, something like Yakshagana, for instance, once more associated with the divine, and but now it's a more secular art form, and it's also part of this discourse of modernity, right? What is modernity? One of the definitions is disenchantment, at least in the Western world. The disenchantment with the sublime, the mystical, the awesome, the supernatural, and even love, for instance. You have in in the Orient, the love is it's tied up with the divine. How else to explain Khajuraho, or Sufism? So this, in this sense, the desacralization brought about by Western modernity. That's what I think they're driving at, this disenchantment with the the magical, more romantic ways of relating to the world. And so I have this wonderful poem in the last in the epilogue of my book by Chandrasekhar Patil. It's called Bandaya, where there is this radical atheist who's just abolished religion from his life. There's no godheads. There's no, festivals in his house. He points his leg towards the temple and sleeps. And but what happens towards the end of the poem? He thinks he's abolished it, but then he sees his wife has brought in agarbattis, and there's a small photograph or idol in the puja room. There is incense, and then they're basically rebelling against him. He can't do anything about it. So what Chandrasekhar Patil is also trying to critique is the futility of this kind of radical washing away of spirituality, or whatever you want to call it, without thinking of what the ramifications are going to be. You can't just wish these things away, right? You can have a mature uh, relationship with it. You can have some kind of a reconciliation, or I'm not just talking about agarbatti or whatever, in broader sense, culture. And so there is so I mean, even myself, when I was 18 or 19, I was listening to Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and all of them. And but after a while, I thought they were as missionary and as zealous as any other religious guy out there. And some of these guys turn out to be very problematic figures, like this guy Sam Harris, for instance. It turns out to be a hardcore Zionist, but he's talking about atheism, and so there are very complicated collusions of ideologies, and this militant atheism. It's not an appealing thing to me anymore. So in this sense, I sympathized with Chandrasekhar Patil's poem and what he was trying to say, which was also a critique of the broader left movements in Karnataka. The poem is titled Bandaya, but what did Bandaya achieve in the end? Maybe that's what's happened to the political reality in this country also. It's come around like a boomerang, because uh, uh, the, there was just this hope that somehow the secular worldview will triumph, and everything else will fade away. But that's not how it worked out.
Understood. My opinions are a little different. I mean, speaking of historic precedent, you have saints, the Tamil saint Ramanujar, who opened up, what was that place? No, not Sringeri, sorry. I forget that city. Was it Kanchi? He opened it up for people of all castes.
Srirangam
Srirangam,
or
yes.
Nelkole.
Srirangam, yes. And
I mean,
my
I'm not sure. I mean, I was just in this book called Ramanuja in Karnataka. I found it in Cambridge. I don't know if he opened it up always. Somewhere it said it opened it up once a day in a year or something like that.
oh,
I'm not sure. I wouldn't. But he's remembered for trying to break these boundaries, and in some sense, there's a Gandhian ring to it. It's the same way Gandhi says Harijan. Ramanuja has, I think he calls them Tirukulattar or something like that. But from what I understood, the Vaishnavite response to caste was nowhere near as radical as the Shaivite, Veerashaiva. Uh, they came immediately after Ramanuja, and the Lingayat movement was very actively militant against caste, and they were far more inclusive than the Vaishnavites, I think.
So essentially, what I wanted to say was that desacralization is inevitable. What you assume to be sacred to you, perhaps by way of caste, gender, creed, race, etc., whatever number of barriers or filters you may put, eventually these filters or barriers will melt away and you will end up, in a way, as the Bhakti movement puts it, merging into the sublime.
Right.
So
Yeah.
perhaps this disenchantment
Mm.
going away, moving away from the romantic movement toward a disenchanted future might technically be what Bhakti said, merging into the sublime. This should have
That's
been,
one way of using it.
this is
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly how this should have been carried out with due respect to tradition. That's one thing I learned from your book is that for any socialist movement, we need to also tread history carefully.
No,
And
which is why I was so interested in Kalburgi and his deep faith in the Lingayat tradition, for instance. So this is a historian. He believes in science, but his political identity, his vision of society, his vision of social egalitarianism, all that he gets from tradition. He gets it from the Lingayat tradition. He believes that there was a genuine aspiration to break these boundaries of caste and so on. So that part of it didn't come from modern ideology. He drew it from a long-standing tradition. And why would you do that? Because that's how it sort of fits into this history, the history of this land, and that's how it connects you with other people who are also part of this, the web of tradition. And so it might be the more mature way is what the takeaway could be.
understood. Now, moving on to contemporary times, Shrikant Shetty and by extension the RSS, they seek to combat fundamentalist hardline versions of Islam. But do they not see that their actions are ending up actually pushing moderate Muslims into the hardline embrace?
I actually asked him. I asked Srikant Shetty to for instance, he says, why do they worship only Tipu Sultan? Why can't they make a hero out of Shishunala Sharifa? And I asked him, why don't you do it? Clearly, you have these ideas. Clearly, you understand what you're. Why doesn't the why don't you do it? And he's like, no, I mean, it would be difficult. And then he's like, even someone like Bhagat Singh, a lot of people in the RSS say he was a Marxist. He was not one of us. So there are these very complicated ideas of who is us and who is them, that has completely taken over the sun, right? And so even if you privately have these ideas, you can't do much about it because you're not going to be in vogue with the party leaders. You're not going to scale the ladder. You're not going to be able to, rise up and make your mark and impress. And so, in that sense, there is, even if there is private acknowledgement, it's stymied by the broader. I mean, there was a recent speech by Mohan Bhagwat. I don't know if you saw it, where he's like, Islam will always be there in India. Joe, and how can we, how will we, how is it possible to erase? People talk about erasing, it's never going to happen. It will always be there. We are always brothers, something like that, he said. And a friend of mine messaged me saying, oh, why would he even, say this? But at some level, the RSS knows that without Islam, there is no Hindutva. It's just, it's joined at the hip. You can call it whatever you want, intimate enemies or uh, violent fraternities or whatever you want to call it. At some level, they also know that you need these two sort of co-creating each other. It's not so different from what's happening in Israel and Palestine, for instance. Netanyahu, he was the biggest financer of Hamas. He boasted about the fact that he's sending them money and keeping them in place. And so the Zionists need the radical Islamists to sustain themselves. Similar sort of relationship is also happening here, I think, and that's the really dangerous bit. That's the bit where you get into a vicious cycle, and you really can't do anything about it.
I call it the politics of othering, cheap
Yeah,
politics, because you don't have the courage to fully execute what you had in mind, but you want to keep the fire simmering so that it keeps burning for a very long time.
yeah, yeah.
Now, my next question is going to be about the Raita
And
Sangha.
how many questions are we down? How much is left? And
I'm choosing because you're covering a
okay,
good
good,
deal of questions which I'd written down. I mean, I'm skipping over a lot of them
good, good, good.
because your responses are covering for most of them.
Okay.
So next one is about the Raita Sangha. Is
Okay.
it a counterfoil to the RSS? Could it possibly ever be?
Counterfoil to the RSS. Um, nah, I don't think. In the sense that it was there's at least one instance where I talk about a farmers leader who had been part of the RSS because of a sort of community bonding effect, and then he later got disenchanted and then moved to the Raita Sangha. In the sense that at the grassroots level, it mobilized uh, uh, people. Maybe in that sense, but I wouldn't call it a counterfoil to the RSS. The farmers movement. There's a more uh, interesting dialectic with the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti, and this is something that Devanur Mahadeva tried to tell me in our interview. He said the farmers have always been the landed class, and Dalits have always been the laborer class. So there's naturally going to be animosity between them, and that's why he says we really tried hard to combine these political platforms through the 80s and 90s. And then he later started the Sarvodaya Karnataka, which is again a grassroots taluk panchayat level political space. Again, trying to bring together farmers and Dalits on the same platform, and it's a small, very small success story in that sense, but nowhere politically really influential or anything of that sort. But that is one interesting binary, perhaps more than the
Under-
RSS.
Understood. My reading of Indian history post-independence was if the land reform movement had succeeded in conjunction with education, perhaps we may have seen a more liberal social outlook. So, which is where the question about Raita Sangha, so uniting labor and putting the espousing the cause of labor more than the plank of caste. That's where the
Hmm.
question is coming from.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Question about espousing the cause of labor, so
Hmm.
that as the uniting factor more than caste.
Right. So that is something that's relevant to our times also. I think we need a strong working class movement because this is something, capitalism is something that affects everybody. It's not just one caste. In that sense, it can be a unifying enemy to for a new working class movement that works intersectionally, that unites men, women, all castes, religions, um, and especially with the rise of AI now, there's going to be so much more, precarity, and there's going to be so much more insecurity. It's already so much, and this is not just for manual labor, even teachers, for instance. Teachers are such a precarious position right now. There's very little pay. They can be everything is contract based. You have yearly contracts, and then afterwards they're renewed. So there were huge protests by teachers in Bangalore a couple of years ago. These are people with PhDs and you know people with higher education creds, but they're not able to settle down because of this rampant contract system. Somehow, this neoliberal idea that everything should come with some kind of a temporary contract. Teachers are paid by the hour. Can you imagine paying a teacher by the hour? Not just teachers, nurses, and sanitation workers, you name it. All of these absolutely vital jobs that really take care of society, they've all been rendered second grade, without remuneration, and so yeah, this is where a new working class movement would really be so heartening, I think.
Absolutely, we are shifting back to the Middle Ages. That is proto-feudalism. I mean, the way that AI is taking us, it's taking us exactly in that same direction, where
Yanis Varoufakis calls it techno feudalism. Yeah.
it is absolutely just that. We're just going back, we're sliding back in time, where the
Yeah.
landed gentry will have everything, and the rest of us, us included, we'll have nothing but scraps to feed on. But of course, you have dialectics like these, which will feed your ego. You will feel good about yourself, but you will probably
Mm.
have to go to bed on an empty stomach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, my next question is going to be about your conversations with Ramaya. Did he tell you how Ananthamurthy's liberal cult of cultural insiders play to the strengths of the right?
Yeah, he talked about Ananthamurthy a fair bit. So for the listener, Kotikanalli Ramaya is a playwright, poet, activist who started this institution called Adima in Kolar, which was in some sense born out of the remnants of the Dalit movement, and they really tried to start a new cultural rejuvenation by going to the heart of what is important, which is children and children's education, and using theater as a sort of holistic space for creative education and so on. And we talked about Ananthamurthy, and he had a bunch of thoughts. For one thing, there was this textbook controversy that was going on, and then he's like, I kept asking people, has Ananthamurthy read textbooks? Has he ever commented on this? And suddenly, you have all these recurring, debates, but have all these big intellectuals ever actually, devoted attention to this? And then he was also talking about, again, what I was saying earlier, this conservative aspect within Ananthamurthy, of this sort of liberal sympathy for tradition. And he said, there, if we are sure where we are, the right is sure where they are, then you have the sort of middlemen who are somehow trying to straddle both, and and this is not an uncommon critique. Like, for instance, Meera Nanda, there's an academic, Meera Nanda, she has a book called Prophets Facing Backwards. And she also makes this similar comment where she's like, look, you have these post colonial thinkers in the second half of the 20th century, Ashish Nandi, Vandana Shiva, Ananthamurthy again fits into this also. So their critique of the Enlightenment, of colonial secularism, of just the idea that secularism as practiced in the West is very different than what was in India. It's more pluralism, and it's not irreligious. It's just it's more it's more diverse and more accommodating. So maybe we need a different word rather than secularism. And so Mirananda says there's this sort of overlapping Venn diagram where the post-colonial left and the Hindutva right unite in this decolonization, harking back to tradition sort of way. But that too, I mean, it's easy to say that, but it's not as simple as that. I think, and even Ramaya, when he's critiquing Ananthamurthy, what I'm thinking is Ramaya himself is very invested in excavating Dalit oral epics like Malimadeshwara Kavya, Mante Swami Kavya. So he too has ideas of using these paths as some kind of artistic, intellectual inspiration for art right now. And so is that not an active relationship with these paths in a way similar to Ananthamurthy? How's that very different? So the more you think about it, it's far more complicated than just sort of blaming the post-colonial left for what came after that. I don't think any of them were actively in collusion with the RSS or whatever. Ananthamurthy spent most of his life railing against them and writing against them, and so at the level of ideas, you can make comparisons. You can say, okay, there is some kind of an overlap, but uh, can you ascribe some kind of a causation? Okay, so there was this post-colonial left that fell for this, and that's why you have the right. No, I don't think it's that simple. It's more complicated than that. Worth thinking about in greater detail, I think.
Now, you're gonna like this. This is my last question.
Oh, oh, great.
So this is going to be borrowing a leaf of inspiration from Ramaya. Can we imagine a non-aligned movement where India imagines its own version of secularism, drawing from rich oral as well as written tradition of non-Aryan, non-Brahmin traditions, express resistance to caste movements, casteist movements, and perhaps even land reform or caste reform movements, and forge our own tryst with secularism? What are your thoughts on this? Will this be the only way India can truly save its masses and not just the handful of 3%?
Well, I mean, I'm with people like Ashish Nandi. He says I prefer the word pluralism to secularism. In fact, my book is dedicated to people who believe in pluralism, and pluralism is much more evocative of things outside of religion. Also, it talks about respecting different ways of life and ways of being in the world, and taking into account other perspectives and it could be anything. It could be caste, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it could be political differences. But something about the word pluralism and the the idea of a reasonable disagreement, that I think appeals to me. But again, the pluralism also carries with it the idea of pluralisms, which is what is uh, uh, interesting to me, in the sense that there are so many ways. There's no one answer to this. It's just you and me talking about this. Some five people might listen to this. One of them might think about these things slightly seriously, and then depending on that person's environment or what where they are or what they do, they'll adapt it to their own circumstances. That's how I think these changes work. They work through friends and family, by you talking to someone and trying to tell them why you think this is important. um, so I'm not a believer in big drastic social revolution happening overnight. I don't think it works that way, but in these small ways, we can try and do a little bit to reimagine how we live in the world, and that's all we can do, I suppose. And that is the sort of hopeful future you can look forward to. I think more people are thinking about these things critically and talking about it, because we have a culture in our country of looking but not seeing. You see it. I mean, you don't talk about it. It's everything is sort of hidden away, beating around the bush, and brushing things under the carpet. That culture, if it goes away and people actually reflect and think and be honest about themselves, that's a hopeful future to have, I think.
I'll latch on to the word imagine. You did mention you had a quote which spoke about imagination. Was it Max? Who? I'm sorry, I don't remember the person's name. You did mention that future needs to be imagined to be brought into essence.
Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't
There was a
recall,
quote
but yeah,
about
I
imagination,
agree.
which
Yeah,
so I will latch on to that word, and whoever is listening to this, this is the keyword for humanity's salvation. You imagine a new future,
yeah.
one
I
with
think yeah.
possibilities for
That's a good
everybody.
way to end this conversation. Yeah, to better imaginations, to
Exactly.
brighter
Thanks, Srikar.
futures.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Srikar, for your time.
thank
And
you.
I guess it's nighttime for you now already.
It's 6:25.
All right. I'll let you slide then. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye bye.
See you.
See you.
Thanks for a wonderful conversation. I mean, I discovered so many things that I didn't know I thought about, but something about this conversation, this beer, uh, brought it out. So thanks for that.
Pleasure is
Yeah,
all mine. Hopefully, more books are in the pipeline.
yeah. Hopefully.
Wonderful. Thanks, Srikar.
So, bye.
Bye bye.